Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Kingwood, a quiet pocket of Houston, does not trend for late-night violence. Yet on a Sunday in late September 2023, patrol units rolled into a cul-de-sac and set a perimeter because a single residence had gone silent after a woman's voice reached emergency dispatch. You'll hear that clip referenced throughout this series, but here is the only part that matters tonight. 911. He said he'd shoot me. A hard pop follows. The line drops. No theatrics, just an impulsive sound consistent with a gunshot captured in real time. From there, the playbook is standard and necessary. First car on scene calls for additional units, long gun overwatch, and med staging out of the line of fire. Outer perimeter locks the street. Inner perimeter narrows to the house. A supervisor takes incident command. A negotiator is assigned. A breaching team is designated but held. Neighbors are moved back. Body-worn cameras stay hot. The goal is simple: preserve life, then evidence. The address belongs to Victoria Anderson, 34. She is the caller on the recording. Inside with her, at least as far as officers can tell from the registration and prior contacts, is her husband, James Paul Anderson, 37, and a small child. Dispatch relays the audio report to the scene. A direct threat was stated, then an impulsive high-energy sound. That detail changes posture. This is no welfare check. It is a barricade with a likely critical injury behind a closed door. Over loudspeaker, officers ask for proof of life. Minutes become long. A child is carried to the door and released to police. Breathing, conscious, transferred immediately to EMS. That one action lowers the temperature without erasing risk. Negotiators press for compliance. They want a surrender at the threshold, hands visible, no sudden movement. When that happens, cuffs go on. The accused is walked to a patrol unit. Only then does the team transition from people first to evidence first. Entry is methodical. No one rushes a room they haven't cleared. When the interior is green lit for medics, what they find is consistent with the audio: an adult female, unresponsive, obvious trauma from a firearm. The house becomes a controlled box. A scene log starts. Every person who crosses the tape signs. A separate officer guards the door solely for chain of custody integrity. Phones, computers, and any potential firearm are noted but not yet discussed here. That belongs to later chapters. Tonight is about the moment the case turned from a call to a homicide investigation. You'll notice two things about how we tell this story. First, we label roles precisely. Victoria Anderson is the victim. James Anderson is the accused. No verdict language, no speculation about motive. Second, we avoid filler. If a fact isn't public, we say, not released. Viewers stay with us because nothing here is padded. In suburbs like Kingwood, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. And in investigations like this, restraint is not softness, it's discipline. The scene in Kingwood moved from uncertainty to control in measured steps. After the first units confirmed a high-risk domestic incident at Victoria Anderson's residence, command shifted from patrol response to barricade management. Streets were blocked in both directions to isolate the address and prevent cross-traffic from rolling into an active zone. The goal was simple and specific: keep people alive, then preserve a scene that would matter later. A supervisor took incident command and divided tasks. One team managed the outer perimeter so neighbors stayed back and sightlines stayed clean. Another team formed the inner perimeter with a shield, a less lethal option, and a designated arrest officer. A negotiator set up near cover, away from the front door, so communication could continue even if movement started inside. Medics were positioned out of the potential line of fire, but close enough to move at a signal. None of this is dramatic. It is how you keep a volatile doorway from turning into a casualty report. Contact began with a clear instruction sequence, repeated and timed. The language is standardized for a reason: show hands, step out, turn around, walk back. Inside the house, a child was heard and then seen. Officers pressed a narrow objective: get the child to safety without triggering a panic response. When a small child was carried to the threshold and released, an officer moved forward undercover, scooped the child, and transferred directly to EMS. That single action changed risk calculus. A life was out of the structure. One silent priority box was checked. What came next followed the same rule set. Negotiators kept their voice steady, avoided accusations, and focused on the next safe move. Tactical officers watched hands, eyes, and the waistline whenever the door cracked. A breaching team waited but did not push. In these cases, forced entry only happens when the threat of delay outweighs the risk of going in. Tonight, patience paid off. The man inside exited on command, hands visible, and was taken into custody without force. He was identified as James Paul Anderson, 37. He was separated from the house, escorted to a patrol unit, and monitored by medical staff as a standard precaution. Only then did the mission flip from crisis to evidence. The front room was frozen in place, not touched until a scene log and a search authority plan were set. Officers moved methodically, room by room, confirming no other persons were inside. When medics were cleared to enter, they moved to the adult female on the floor. The assessment was brief. The outcome was clear. The woman, identified on scene as 34-year-old Victoria Anderson, showed injuries consistent with a single gunshot. A homicide investigation was now the working posture. If you are watching this to learn how investigators think, this is the moment to note the guardrails. The audio from the emergency call was flagged for preservation. Any potential firearm visible in the common areas was photographed before collection. Door frames, handles, and obvious points of entry were documented before being touched. Electronics were noted for later legal process rather than explored on the spot. Chain of custody started at the threshold and followed every item to the evidence room. This is how you avoid contamination and how you defend a case long after the lights on the cul-de-sac are off. There is a human side here, and it is not complicated. A child left that house because strangers in uniforms did the dull, careful work exactly by the book. In suburbs like this, murders don't just break the law, they rupture the routine that lets families feel safe. You do not fix that with speeches. You fix it by getting the sequence right: containment, communication, compliance, custody, and then stepping back so the forensic process can do its job. Viewers sometimes ask, why not push in earlier if a shot was already heard on the call? Because rushing a barricade can multiply victims and destroy evidence. Because there are seconds when a negotiator's calm tone matters more than a ram. Because the safest way to the truth is still the slow way. Save who you can, then let the facts speak. As for that first read of the scene, the one shaped by a recorded threat and a single explosive sound, investigators are trained to treat it as a lead, not a conclusion. The timeline looks clean now. Call, threat, crack, standoff, surrender, discovery. The data align too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. The next step is to test every piece in that sequence against what the house, the devices, and the lab will say. The door closed behind the entry team and the room turned into work. This is where the case stops being a rumor and becomes a record. A scene log started at the threshold, time-stamped against body-worn camera clocks. A single route in and out was used so nothing important got kicked under a rug or tracked across a floor that might matter later. Lead investigators walked the common areas first, then the hallway, then the room where Victoria Anderson was found. Nothing movable was touched before it was photographed in place. Wide shots fixed the layout, mid-range framed key objects, and close-ups set baselines for edges, surfaces, and potential marks. Any visible cartridge casing or deformity in drywall was marked for trajectory measurement but left as is until the camera work and measurements were complete. It is slow on purpose. Medical personnel confirmed what dispatch audio suggested could be true. Victoria had a fatal gunshot wound. The medical examiner's team assumed custody following pronouncement, and the transport was documented with identifiers, seals, and signatures. Cause and manner would be the ME's call after examination, but for now, detectives worked with a preliminary understanding that a firearm had been discharged inside the home and that a single adult victim was dead as a result. No one on the scene speculated about range, caliber, or sequence. Those conclusions belong to the lab and the autopsy report, not to hallway conversations. Phones, a tablet, and a home computer were noted and bagged in anti-static sleeves, left powered down pending legal process. A living room TV and a doorbell camera hub were photographed where they sat. If a residence has network devices, detectives document the presence first and ask for login details later with a warrant. The emergency call already provided a clock. Every other clock in this case, body cam clips, key AD times, and any surviving device logs would be synchronized to it. The kitchen sink, door handles, and light switches were swabbed on a limited, targeted plan. GSR kits were reserved for the appropriate hands if policy and timing justified it, with the understanding that residue can move, fade, or be absent for reasons that do not prove or disprove a theory. Detectives flagged obvious collection risks and kept the sample set realistic. Overcollecting can bury the signal. Trajectory work came next. Investigators established reference points and used rods and lasers to see if any line of travel could be measured without damaging the scene. If a round struck drywall or trim, the angle was recorded, then compared against the possible shooter and victim positions implied by furniture placement and footprints. The team marked each observation as provisional. The point is to build options, not to force a single story on the room. A separate officer documented the child's clothing before EMS finished preliminary care. That documentation was clinical, not dramatic, and it stopped where policy requires. No interviews, no assumptions. The child's safety took precedence over everything else. Viewers sometimes want a neat psychological narrative right here. Real cases do not work that way. What matters now is that a young child left the house alive, and that every step the adults took around that child is memorialized for court. Detectives then moved to the garage and master bedroom for quick, high-yield checks. If a gun was visible, it was photographed in place, made safe, and packaged. If no firearm was seen in open view, that absence was recorded exactly as written. No firearm observed in plain view in X locations. It's as important to document what is not there as what is. Either statement will be tested against later search warrant returns and lab work. Meanwhile, the 911 audio was duplicated for evidentiary use and protected with hash values so a defense expert can confirm integrity later. Investigators built a working event line, a call reporting a threat, a sharp impulse sound consistent with a gunshot, a barricade, a surrender, a deceased adult inside. That line is not a verdict, it is a scaffolding. The next layers, ballistics, device timelines, and statements, will either reinforce it or force changes. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. That thought stayed in the back of the room where seasoned detectives keep their caution. There is room for empathy even in a room like this. A person with a name, Victoria Anderson, will not walk back out of her house. The work honors that fact by being exact. In suburbs like Kingwood, trust is built on routine. Kids on bikes, sprinklers at dusk, lights going off on time. When violence breaks that, justice is not just punishment. It is a sequence you can show, step by step, to a jury and to a family who needs the truth to be squared with the record. Before a case moves an inch, investigators verify who is who. In Kingwood, that started with lawful identity confirmation for the two adults at the address. Victoria Anderson, 34, deceased. James Paul Anderson, 37, in custody. Those aren't just names. They're the anchors for everything that follows. Next of kin notifications, subpoenas, device extractions, employment contacts, and, if needed, family law records. Accuracy here prevents later fights about mix-ups and timelines. The paperwork is the first truth the case can stand on. From there, detectives mapped only the background that helps explain risk. Victoria's role in the home, her recent schedule, and any known stress points were logged through people who could speak to them: parents, a close friend, a supervisor if appropriate. The point wasn't to tell a life story, it was to find concrete levers that change behavior: financial strain, custody stress, or a recent split. Anything not on record or not relevant stayed out. That discipline matters. This audience doesn't need rumor. It needs facts that hold up when someone presses play on a body cam or when a timeline hits a courtroom screen. For the accused, investigators confirmed employment history the way they always do. Call the district, request HR verification, note the title and dates. If one outlet lists him as a special education department chair and another lists him as a former teacher in a nearby district, that discrepancy is recorded as a media discrepancy, not adopted as fact until the district answers in writing. What HR confirms dictates the next step, whether there are work-issued devices, institutional emails, or campus access logs to seek under warrant. That's not gossip, it's a data map. If a person's day runs on an educator's calendar, those entries, with legal process, can later anchor a timeline of where he was and when he was supposed to be there. Detectives also examined what the 911 recording already suggested: a verbal threat and a single explosive sound consistent with a gunshot. That combination is a documented domestic violence lethality indicator in most American training guides, threats plus firearm access. You don't need a lecture to understand what that means. You just need the system to act fast when the box is checked. In suburbs like Kingwood, safety is often built on routine. When that routine fails, process is the only way back to clarity. Locate weapons, document access, verify training or ownership records, and lock down any purchase history through lawful requests. On the human side, there's a line investigators rarely say on microphone but think often: life pressures don't excuse violence, but they can predict it. That's why the background work stays narrow and factual. Did Victoria speak about safety concerns to someone close? Did a friend receive a message earlier in the week that now matters? And were there recent changes in childcare, counseling, or housing? Each answer is tagged with a source and a timestamp. If it's not sourced, it doesn't drive the case. The child at the scene required its own careful path: guardian coordination, medical checks, documentation of clothing, and immediate separation from investigative questions. Any future interview would follow child forensic protocols off-site with specialists and only if authorized. That protects the child and protects the record. No shortcuts, no on-scene fishing. Viewers often want the why right now. Real work resists that and builds a timeline that won't collapse on cross-examination. By the end of this pass, the file had solid basics: verified identities, a declared relationship, husband and wife, a residence confirmed as the single interior scene, and a list of records to request that actually matter: HR verifications, device inventories, and, if applicable, family court filings narrowly tied to risk. Nothing speculative, no reach, just the parts of a personal history that change the weight of evidence later. If you're following along, the story isn't drama. It's a set of small, accountable steps that make the next move possible. There's an unavoidable human note here. Victoria's name should be centered, not swallowed by process. Saying her name and getting the facts right is a form of respect. We also acknowledge the child who left that house because the slow, careful steps worked. If you've lived in a quiet neighborhood, you know how fast a single event can redefine a street. The value in telling this case well is simple. When people recognize warning signs, threats plus a weapon, they take them seriously and call early. As we transition to the next stage, think about the narrowness of what we've included. No life stories, no speculation about motive, just the verified roles, confirmed points of contact, and the records that will matter in court. That restraint is what keeps this series coherent. One address, one case, one timeline that doesn't fracture as we get deeper. Reconstructing a homicide means putting clocks in a straight line. For the Anderson case, the line begins the day before the call. Investigators built it from sources that don't argue: dispatch records, body cam timestamps, cell site pings, doorbell time codes, and ordinary calendar entries that quietly say where people plan to be. You don't need a theory to start, you need times that agree. The reference clock is the emergency recording. 911. He said he'd shoot me. Followed by a single sharp report. That audio, already preserved, gives T0. Everything else moves backward from there. CAD shows when the first unit was dispatched, who arrived, and when the perimeter locked. Body cams confirm those stamps to the second. The work in this chapter is the hours before that sequence. Movements, messages, and deviations from routine that matter because they set up the moment the line goes silent. Detectives pulled recent phone logs under a lawful request. They weren't looking for gossip. They wanted objective markers: outgoing and incoming calls, duration, and the rough location data modern networks keep. If a call hits a Kingwood sector in the early evening and a different sector near a grocery store an hour before, that's a breadcrumb. Combine that with a bank authorization for a purchase and you get a place in a minute without asking anyone to remember under pressure. The goal is not to paint a personality. It's to confirm movement that the scene later has to make sense of. Household devices helped set the normal rhythm. A smart thermostat shows when a door stayed open unusually long. A phone calendar shows a canceled commitment that would have put someone out of the house. A school email confirms a staffer left campus at a predictable time. Each piece is mundane alone. Together they mark who likely arrived home first and whether there was a window when both adults were present. In cases like this, present together often narrows the window in which a fatal event could occur to less than an hour. Friends and family filled gaps with verifiable notes. Texts saved on their phones, not memories retold after news broke. A friend might provide a message from Victoria about a plan for the next morning. If that plan never happens, the absence itself becomes a data point. Detectives tag each contribution with a screenshot, a device ID, and a time pulled from the original phone. Then they check if the network provider's log agrees. Human statements steer you to the right drawer. The drawer has to contain a receipt. The home's own electronics offered quiet confirmations. If a doorbell camera recorded motion in the late afternoon, the file's metadata shows the exact time. If the family never subscribed to cloud storage, detectives document that absence and ask neighbors for a share of their front porch recordings. Nothing in that hunt changes the established scene. This is still a single interior homicide inside the Anderson home, but it can prove whether anyone other than the household approached a door in the key window. In this case file, the focus stayed tight. Establish entry and exit patterns, not speculate about strangers. Now to the hours closest to T0. Here, investigators look for friction, missed calls, a conversation that ended abruptly, a calendar reminder dismissed at a time when hands should have been busy elsewhere. One message matters more than most: the verbal threat captured on the emergency line. Training flags the combination of a threat and a firearm as a high-risk indicator, and this case presents that pair. Still, the team treated the call as a guide, not a verdict. They kept checking. Were there any attempts to call back? Did a neighbor hear a loud impact at a time that matches the recording? Do the timestamps line up across sources, or is there drift that needs to be corrected? A quick word about autopsy work because it plays into timelines without getting graphic. The medical examiner provides two anchors that matter here: an estimated time of death and confirmation that a single gunshot was fatal. That estimate is never a perfect minute, but combined with the emergency call, it narrows the window enough to test every theory that comes later. No one in this series is going to announce a range or caliber not released by authorities. What you need to know is that the medical findings and the call's time line up in a way that makes the rest of the sequence plausible. Investigators close this chapter with a clean, checkable map. An ordinary Sunday that progressed through familiar errands, devices that woke and slept on schedule, and two adults likely home together in the last stretch before T0. No missing person detours, no second scene, no sudden cameo from an outsider. The quiet of a Houston suburb, then a call that turns a routine night into a permanent record. We keep the file human by remembering Victoria Anderson had plans on her calendar and people who expected to see her. We keep it accurate by showing our work. If you live in a place like Kingwood, you recognize the value of ordinary habits. Texting when you're on the way, setting a reminder, letting the doorbell camera run. Those aren't just conveniences. In a case like this, they're anchors. A community stays safer when people treat early threats seriously and leave trails that can be checked when everything else becomes noise. Discipline makes room for compassion by getting the facts right the first time. The next move was to test the clean-looking sequence against evidence that doesn't care how it should read. Investigators took the emergency recording, the threat, then a single sharp impulse, and treated it as T0, the master tick. Every other clock had to align: CAD dispatch times, body-worn camera time codes, the residence's electronics, and any phone metadata obtained by lawful process. If two clocks disagreed, they were corrected or set aside. A neat story is useless if the minutes don't match. Audio technicians profiled the call. No dramatics, just waveform analysis and a level check. The impulse on the line measured as a high-energy transient consistent with a gunshot. That does not say who fired or from where. It places a loud, sudden event seconds after a verbal threat. The recording's internal clock was verified against the carrier's server time. With that anchor, detectives created a simple ladder: first unit dispatched, first unit on scene, perimeter locked, negotiator arrives. Bodycam metadata matched the CAD ladder within seconds, a good sign the time base would hold in court. Inside the house, the first pass trajectory work was compared to T0. The room with Victoria Anderson had one apparent line of travel to document. Measurements were provisional and limited, enough to tell a lab where to look for microtrace and where not to waste time. The point wasn't to publish an angle, it was to see whether a single discharge inside that room made sense when laid against the moment captured on the phone line. Here, it did. The initial findings supported one interior event, not a struggle that pinged from room to room, not multiple rounds across the house. Digital artifacts filled small but important gaps. A doorbell hub, present but not over-relied on, provided motion timestamps earlier in the day. A subscriber without cloud backup is common. That absence was documented plainly. Phone extractions, processed under warrant, offered message and call logs with to-the-minute stamps. Those logs were not read for gossip. They were lined up against T0 to confirm that certain conversations ended well before the call and that no one else contacted the house at the critical minute. Calendar entries and reminders helped confirm typical Sunday routines: errands, a return home, and no scheduled departure close to T0. The effect was simple. The window for the fatal event remained narrow and inside the residence. Forensically, restraint mattered as much as discovery. Gunshot residue screening, if performed, would be time-sensitive and limited in what it could prove. Results like present, absent, or inconclusive do not settle who fired. Detectives documented whether collection was completed and moved on. The medical examiner's early report confirmed what was already evident. A single gunshot caused Victoria's death. The estimated time of death and the emergency call were consistent, which is what you want, a medical anchor that doesn't fight the clocks. The team also validated audio integrity. Copies of the call were hashed. Those hash values were logged so any expert could later confirm the file was unchanged. The same was done for key video clips pulled from body cameras, one set for immediate investigative use, another sealed. Chain of custody procedures are not television-friendly, but they are how a jury trusts that what they're hearing is the same file recorded on the night of the incident. If you live in a neighborhood like Kingwood, the technology in your pocket and at your door probably feels routine. In a homicide case, routine becomes accountability. We keep a human center here, Victoria Anderson's name, a child removed from a dangerous house, but the path to justice stays technical on purpose. In towns like this, murders don't just break the law, they damage the idea that nights are predictable. The fix is unglamorous. Verify the minutes, confirm the path of a single round, and show that the devices and the body cams tell the same story as the call. A quick word about doubt. The timeline aligned almost too neatly. Experienced detectives keep a margin for error. They looked for any offset between the phone carrier's server time and the body cam clock, for frame drops in the longest camera clip, and for any late-night motion on neighboring cameras that might challenge the single event reading. Nothing credible surfaced to split the scene or move it elsewhere. The case stayed what it was: one address, one interior homicide, one recorded crack that the lab could live with. Once the house was locked down and the core facts were stable, the file moved from detectives to prosecutors. In Harris County, that starts with a probable cause packet. The emergency recording time-stamped as T0, responding officers' reports, the interior scene documentation, and the medical examiner's preliminary finding of a single fatal gunshot. On that record, the state filed a murder charge and booked the case into the 208th District Court. A magistrate reviewed risk and set bond at $300,000 with standard conditions: no firearms, no contact with protected parties, and compliance checks. James Paul Anderson posted bond and awaited trial while discovery began. Discovery in a homicide is not theatrical, it's scheduled. The state turned over digital copies of the preserved call audio, selected body-worn camera clips, and the initial lab paperwork that confirmed what we've covered. One discharge, one victim, no evidence of a second event elsewhere. Defense counsel inspected those materials and requested anything that could cut a different line through the night. Device anomalies, timing offsets, audio integrity issues, the hashes matched, the clock stayed in agreement, and nothing credible appeared to fracture the sequence established in Chapters 1-6. Pretrial practice followed the usual path. There were settings to confirm counsel, requests for additional lab notes, and a standing order to exchange expert summaries if either side planned to call one. Suppression was discussed in narrow lanes, whether any statement or item needed a hearing. The high-value questions, who was present when a single gunshot occurred, what the medical examiner could say, were not in serious dispute on paper. The real fight would have been about interpretation and intent at trial. That's where plea talks entered. Texas statutes set a broad range for murder. Harris County's docket realities and the strength of a state's timeline often frame negotiations. Here, the prosecution's leverage was simple. A recorded threat, seconds before a fatal gunshot, corroborated by synchronized clocks, and a scene that did not wander. Defense leverage, as in most violent crime cases, was the uncertainty of how a jury would weigh state of mind, any claimed provocation, or other mitigating themes. The two sides met in the middle space common to homicide calendars, and by publicly reported accounts, the expectation set for September 26, 2025 was a guilty plea with a 35-year sentence. To be clear, that expectation is not a verdict. A defendant is not convicted until judgment is signed. But plea calendars are public for a reason. Victims' families, here, Victoria Anderson's, deserve to know when a case may resolve, and the community has an interest in transparent outcomes. The court scheduled the plea, docketed warnings, and prepared the paperwork that would have formalized a conviction if the plea had been entered. That is as far as the law goes until all parties stand in the courtroom and the judge takes the plea on the record. There's a human current under those logistics. A family in Kingwood needed finality. A child needed stability. Prosecutors kept them informed while staying within the rules. Investigators stayed available in case a last-minute question surfaced about the timeline or the lab. Nothing changed. The technical backbone from earlier chapters, timed audio, consistent body cam metadata, and a medical finding that fit, held steady as the case rolled toward a scheduled resolution. We keep one promise in this series: no second endings, no drift to another story. The next part is brief, factual, and difficult. On the morning set for the plea, events inside the courthouse did not go as planned. That's where we go next, exactly what happened, why the prosecution could not continue, and how the law treats a case when a defendant dies before judgment is entered. Kingwood, Houston. A Sunday night in late September 2023 turned into a record the law could stand on. A 911 call from Victoria Anderson, a spoken threat, a single sharp report, and a home secured as an interior homicide scene. Officers contained the address, removed a 3-year-old to safety, and took James Paul Anderson into custody without force. Inside, medics confirmed what the recording implied. Victoria was dead from a single gunshot. Detectives documented the house, preserved the audio, synced clocks from CAD and body cams, logged devices, and handed the body to the medical examiner. No second scene, no alternate timeline, just one address and a sequence the evidence could support. Over 2 years, the file moved the way homicide files move, charging in the 208th District Court $300,000 bond with conditions, discovery, and scheduled hearings. The backbone stayed firm. Call, crack, interior scene, medical confirmation. Negotiations followed. By public reporting in court settings, September 26, 2025 was reserved for a guilty plea carrying 35 years. Families were notified. Paperwork was prepared. The case was ready to close the way most strong cases close, on the record, not in a spectacle. It didn't. After arriving at court that morning, James Paul Anderson suffered a medical emergency. A bailiff administered naloxone. EMS transported him to Ben Taub Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The medical examiner took jurisdiction. Final toxicology wasn't public at the time. Under Texas law, prosecution abates when a defendant dies before conviction. No judgment is entered. No sentence appears. The evidence remains. The criminal process ends there. That is the only ending to this case. We keep the human center clear. Victoria's name deserves care, not noise. A child left that house alive because responders followed the book: containment, communication, custody, and then evidence. A family prepared for a plea learned that the law sometimes closes without a sentence, only a docket entry and preserved files. In suburbs like Kingwood, routine is how safety feels. Discipline is how justice works when routine breaks. The habits that mattered here are simple and worth repeating. Treat explicit threats with a firearm as urgent, call early, and let trained people manage the door. If you've watched this far, you know why we told it this way. One spine, no drift, no second ending. Victoria Anderson is the victim. James Paul Anderson was the accused, later deceased before conviction. The place is Kingwood, Houston, Texas. The dates are fixed. Incident in late Sep 2023. Courthouse emergency on September 26, 2025. Everything else is commentary that this story doesn't need. For anyone living with coercion or threats that involve a gun, there is help and there is a process built to move fast when you call. We honor Victoria by keeping the facts clean and the warning plain. Threats plus access to a firearm move risk from theory to imminent. Take them seriously. Call. And if you're the friend who gets the text, believe it and help make that call. This case is closed in our series exactly where the record ends, at the courthouse threshold, where a plea never became a conviction and where the evidence stands as a final statement for Victoria. I've told this case as I'd want it told for my own family. Clean facts, one ending, and Victoria's name at the center. Here's what I carry forward. When someone voices a threat and a gun is in the picture, act, distance, call 911, let the process work. Quiet habits, saving texts, keeping clocks synced can save lives. Do you agree or see it differently? What would you add from your own town? If this story moved you or didn't, tell me why and where you're watching from. And if you want more real cases told straight, hit subscribe and stay with us for the next episode.